Jacob Sadaboy.
And we are here with May Beaubrun. May is one of the contributors to the text, and she wrote about urban planning from an ABA lens. So May, if you can talk to us a little bit about what does that even mean, urban planning through an ABA lens or perspective?
Before we get started, I just want to thank both of you for the opportunity, not just for the contribution, but also just to be able to verbally kind of just discuss on a platform like this what this is all about. So thank you for that. And so urban planning, first I want to just talk about what it is and then kind of through an ABA lens, because I kind of took a couple of leaps to bridge the two. So when we talk about urban planning, it's like developing, designing, and organizing urban areas. And by urban, I'd mean in terms of the population density and the amount of developed land. So that's like residential, commercial, and industrial property. Because I know that sometimes urban is code for an area, a Black community or an inner city or an area with a lot of minorities or people of color. But when you hear urban planning, what it should mean is specifically towards areas with a dense population and areas that are just more developed than, let's say, a rural or suburban area in terms of residential, commercial, and industrial properties. But with the focus on advocating for social justice within the community. So that's kind of a quick overview of what urban planning is. In terms of the behavior analytic lens, is that through our code of ethics and I'm referring to Michelle, who's also BCBA, is that social justice refers to like making sure that everyone has an equitable opportunity. And that's kind of written right into our code. So as behavior analysts, efforts towards social justice should be something that's important to us and to our field. And then a little bit later, I'm going to talk about kind of how data collection can be applied and what behavior analysts can personally do to kind of help towards this effort.
Fantastic. Can you just like kind of share some of the challenges that happen in these communities with respects to resources and access to education and health, which you touched on in the chapter?
Right. So I'm going to do just a very brief history because you kind of have to understand that to understand what's happening presently. So the United States has a long history of inequality. And although a lot of those systems are no longer in place, their effects are still very, very prevalent. So I'm talking about the institution of slavery, forcing indigenous people off their land, Jim Crow laws, segregation, internment camps, like I said, no longer in existence, but they still have such an impact on our society. And that's in housing, education, healthcare, law enforcement, and prison. I'm just going to kind of highlight just one in each aspect. So housing, for example, around the time of the civil rights movement, there was something you guys might have heard the term redlining, and it was basically making sure that that Black people weren't able to own property and forced to kind of live in areas where there is high poverty, and with high poverty leads to high crime, less opportunities for jobs. And as we look today, where those red lines are drawn in those major cities like a Detroit and things like that, they're still suffering from those effects from the redlining. So the access to kind of proper healthcare and education still impact the people who live in those communities. In terms of education, we know that the way that the better the school district funding is coming through taxes. And so in areas where it's more people are renting, they're not owning homes, they're not paying property taxes, there's virtually no funding to go into the schools. And those areas are the same redlined areas. For the green zones, it's basically like the opposite of the red line. In those areas, lots of home ownership, because that was the plan for redlining, is that give more home ownership to whites, more property taxes because there's more homes, better resources to the school, and not only for the school, but also for the teachers who are working in the schools. So that's kind of how it impacts education. Healthcare, in terms of, I want to bring up, there's like so many things to bring up, but I'll pinpoint grocery stores. That's the one I want to bring up. So, because I think that's a very direct correlation with redlining. So, there's still these redlined cities that up until recently, their nearest supermarket was miles and miles away. And in urban areas, the way that I'm referring it to, transportation is usually with a train or a bus. But if you have to transfer several buses in order to get to like a major chain food store or go around the block, and it's like a more of a local place that has foods that are just processed foods, high GMOs, nothing is organic, high sodium. It's just more convenient and to go into those areas to consume those foods, which are going to now cause a health disparity. So again, direct correlation from redlining. In terms of law enforcement and prison, I'll kind of put those two together. We have what's often referred to the school to prison pipeline. Unfortunately, in the red line areas, we see like a high police population, and not necessarily for a deterrent of crime, but the more you look for something, the more you'll see it. I'm going to make a very casual analogy. Like the more you look for like pores on your skin, the more you're going to find them. From far away, you guys probably can't see any, but if I zoomed in super close and kind of kept looking, like eventually you're gonna find some. And so the same thing, kind of like now with these very minor infractions, such as loitering, we're seeing that that young kids who aren't in school when they're supposed to be, as opposed to getting a ride back to school, they're getting a ride now to prison. So the kind of the presence of law enforcement is helping that school to prison pipeline, which is showing that with the poor education system leads to individuals more likely to be going to prison. And just one stat that I want to share is that for an individual moving from a high poverty to a low poverty area will automatically reduce the likelihood of a teen pregnancy, improve college attendance, and also increase income by 30%.
This was such an interesting contribution to read. I feel like I had an awareness of some of these things, but it really brought a lot of light into some other areas that I wasn't so aware of. And it's interesting now having that perspective and walking around, different areas and kind of seeing it. I'm like, oh wow, there isn't a Whole Foods here, right? Or there isn't even a ShopRite. It's a lot of like you said, smaller chains or bodegas or like things of that nature. And you really you shed so much light, I think, that a lot of us just sort of we're just sort of blind to. We kind of just take for granted, well, that's that neighborhood, and that's just how it's set up. When there was like a very specific reason why it was designed essentially that way. What can we do? I mean, we've all come together in this text, right, as mostly behavior analysts who share a common interest in social justice and wanting to do better, right, and make these situations better. Are there any things that we can do specifically from our discipline? You had mentioned data collection before, but what are some things that we can do to help improve the situation?
As a behavior analyst, I'm going to talk about me and other behavior analysts at the individual level, is to kind of join efforts to kind of analyze and evaluate the effects of urban planning initiatives. So we're not experts in urban planning. Like even though I did author this chapter, I'm not an expert in urban planning, but our expertise lies in defining behaviors and collecting data and interpreting those data sets to promote effective interventions to replace societal structures that impede, for example, the Black community from thriving. By data collection, we're looking at like economic data, socio-demographic information, events, such as looking like in certain communities, looking at what the birth rate is. Versus, what I mean by birth rate, it's like infants who are born, what is their mortality rate? And also looking at causes of death in certain areas as well. And looking at both quantitative and qualitative data, like what do parks and amenities look like in certain areas? The street scape, so the stop signs and the children at play signs and things like that. What is accessibility? And then also looking at those surveys and interviews. So I know that that's a lofty goal, and it doesn't mean that somebody kind of has to be like a crusader, but if you have the opportunity, so if social justice is important to you, it's likely that even if it's something as casual as a Facebook group. Do you know what I mean? If you can connect with other individuals who are directly involved, that as a behavior analyst, you can help with this. You know what I mean? Because what I like about it, about one of the things I like about being a behavior analyst is how objective I get to be. Because I think that that's when we discuss these things, it's like, oh, you're looking for the disparity and that's why you found it. You know what I mean? But all of us as behavior analysts, we know that we're not looking for problem behavior to occur. We're not looking for what needs to be changed. Something already needs to be changed. What we're doing is evaluating the interventions, like, should we keep going with it or should we change it? So I think that's an important thing that behavior analysts can do. And I know that lately, a lot of the journal articles are moving away from some of the traditional topics that are being published. So this is a really good example. Everything I've mentioned is it's local or state official, information. Like, these are things that you can kind of look up about your own community. Like, if you wanted to know in your town versus the neighboring town, like how many restaurants were there, how many supermarkets were there, like you can look that kind of stuff up. So this would be a great opportunity for someone who is looking to get published, doesn't want to compete with everybody else, writing about, response interruption redirection. This is something that'll definitely kind of stand out, because I know that there's been a big push with different journals for something that's more geared to topics such as social justice. So I think that this would be really, really good at an individual level. I think at a broader sense, like looking at society, there has to be like culturally competent urban planning. So that means it has to be diverse, it has to be equitable, it has to be inclusive, and it has to address issues that are related to diverse communities. Also looking at what the positive impact on like urban economy. So something like jobs within the city that are going to attract investors are going to generate economic activity. So that's why I said this is on a bigger level, but like, like I like that we said, Michelle, like this is by design that these, the Black communities and these redlined areas are like this. So one way to change it is to kind of do what America wants, capitalism, So like by building a Whole Foods in that neighborhood, now you're going to attract investors. There's going to be more job opportunities. There's going to be healthy food options for the individuals in that community. Do you know what I mean? Like, we have to think differently, because you're right. It's kind of like, this is just how it is. You know what I mean? Like, if the one or two times a year that I'll go is when I have access to a car. That's when I'll get up and I'll drive there. Do you know what I mean? And everyone just kind of accepts it as what it is. But let's think about it differently, and not just for us right now, but the big part about urban planning is, what is this going to do? What's the sustainability for future generations as well?
I really appreciate the hope that you're communicating. You had shared initially in the very beginning, like kind of the historical background as to like kind of why this is currently in place, and why it's now like kind of like part of like kind of the culture, like kind of it's systemic. And so I guess like kind of one of the challenges we have is that you're right, people get resigned. People are saying that this is the way it is, this is the way it's always been. How can, or what recommendations do you have for people to start acting, to start like kind of seeing that this is an injustice, something needs to get done? What are some like kind of initial first steps that people can take within the field of behavior analysis, or even in other fields?
I think in the field of behavior analysis, and I'm sure this will be applicable in other fields as well, is something that I'm trying to talk a lot more about, is going back to that, like that culturally competent care. And in our field, we're a little bit more behind than some of our counterparts, like social work and things like that, where they already have like courses or topics that are embedded, like when someone's a student to become a social worker, for example, that's already part of the curriculum that they're going to. And so our field is changing a little bit right now, but I think a first step is kind of looking at the culturally competent care. And I don't know if I might be breaking this down to a too small of a level, but like you said, it's a first step. But recently I heard about a situation where this is for like an ABA home program. And there was a young child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, but they were in a crib. And the first thought of that behavior analyst was kind of like, is this a call now to the Division of Children and Families because this is a restraint and it's so restrictive that the child is in there, as opposed to taking a step back and thinking like, what are the why is this child, at 5 in a crib? It could just be as simple as it's their first child and they didn't know. They just didn't know that, like, oh, by 5, even though it's a small 5-year-old and they love sleeping in there, or maybe they tried it and it was a disaster. It was one of the worst nights of their entire lives. And they're like, you know what? We're definitely not ready for this. Once we have therapy in the home, then we can address it. It could also just be a matter of safety. What if this is a child who in the middle of the night now is, climbing on things that they're not supposed to, and it's just kind of a safer thing. So rather than automatically going to think, oh, this is a problem, I have to report this person, look to see kind of why are we in this situation, and then how can I help address it afterwards. So I that might be kind of taking too much of a step back, but I think when we look at those disparities in health and in education and housing, not just assuming that it's someone's fault that they're in that situation. So I think shifting our mindset might be the first thing as to why is a certain individual in this particular situation, and then is there anything that we can do to kind of mitigate that? Because I think a lot of the times why we're in this mentality that it's always been this way is that clearly it's somebody's fault. You know what I mean? Because if I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, why aren't they?
You're right, and I guess this goes back to Michelle's original point, where if you're not contacting the communities, or it's just part of your learning history, and it's assumed or could be assumed that's a choice, and not like kind of systemic like kind of racism that started from slavery and has not and has continued for generations now. It's fantastic.
Yeah, you're right. Like sometimes, I'm doing another departure kind of here, but right now, it's great to have so many people who are just aware of all these inequities and want to kind of help promote, but then, when we think about, so many times I think like, how are we still here? You know what I mean? Like how are we still fighting so hard, and how have we still not achieved equality? And I think back, especially like to the civil rights movement, like how come everybody wasn't fighting? And I was reading or listening to something recently, and a lot of individuals wanted to be part of it, but they were, it was let's say a 1-income family, and if their white boss found out that they were protesting, they would lose their job. You know what I mean? So like that's what I mean by like thinking of other people's perspective. So before blaming somebody, like, you know what, if that was me, if I was around in the 50s and 60s, I would be doing X, Y, and Z. How are they standing back and letting it happen? They wanted to be part of the fight. You know what I mean? But their circumstances didn't allow them to. So I think that's the even though it's a small one, the very first step is just to kind of shift our mindsets a little bit. So I think once individuals are aware of it, and they're already advocates for social justice, opportunities for change will present themselves in terms of like what you can say, what you can do, what you can write, what posts you can share. Like we're fortunate that we live in a time where we can spread a lot of information to a lot of people very quickly.
A couple of things were showing up for me as you were just talking. I mean, I think number one, we have to be mindful of those competing contingencies, right? Because it's never just that easy. There's always factors that other people aren't aware of. Sometimes we're not even aware of all of the variables. We might go and do something with the best of intentions and then get the backlash and have to suffer the repercussions of it. Another thing that's coming up for me too, kind of going back to something you had said earlier, I feel like that example that you gave with the BCBA, right, probably went in there and wanted to fix it, right, wants to like do the right thing. And again, well-intended, but you're not taking into account all of the all of the variables that might be at play. And I think that's something that's also been a theme across all of these conversations. And that's why I want to highlight it. But yet again, is that we need to like stop, take a step back, and not be, I like that you said crusaders. Like, but just because sometimes we go in there like this, like, one BCBA army or something like that. And we're just going to like take over. And we really need to like calm down, and take it all in. So I think that that's a really valid point too, is, yeah, like you're there, you have the tools to fix the problem, no doubt. Nobody's questioning your skill set. But just like be a little bit more of an observer and a listener and a question asker. And I had something else I was going to say. Now I forgot what it was, but it'll come back to me.
It'll come back. Yeah. No, and I thanks so much for pointing that out. And I like what you said about like the whole like the calm down thing. Like I feel like we need to redirect, that passion needs to be redirected. You know what I mean? Like it's there. You know what I mean? But like it has to be kind of applied in a manner that's going to be most effective and most efficient, in my opinion.
I concur.
Yeah, absolutely. Just the ability to listen, right? Because if you're not listening, you're not going to, as Michelle pointed out, learn of all the variables. And if you don't learn all the variables, the intervention is not going to be successful. And you don't have a lot of necessarily opportunities to make a change on this grand scale. So like kind of you don't want to be swinging and missing because you haven't done your due diligence in learning and assessing the environment before coming up with recommendations. So yeah, essentially like take home message would just be thoughtful.
Yeah, absolutely.
I got my thought back. Yeah, I think, to your point, May, I think going into a home and making that your learning ground, right, where you can make those small changes there, right? Like we all, sometimes it's like that go big or go home mentality. And everybody's path to growth and to helping to make some kind of change in the world is going to be different, right? Sometimes it's just making, the donation in a little jar to save a dog, like in a shelter somewhere.
Yeah.
It's a small gesture, but it's something. You're making a contribution. And I don't think that any step should be overlooked. So I think for that BCBA or that practitioner, whoever they are, the social worker that goes in and mindfully makes a change, or hears something and stops and says, okay, that's my bias based on my learning history. Let me pause and let me figure this out before I, call Child Protective Services on this person, because maybe they can't afford a bed and that's why the child's still in a crib, and going back to looking at all of those variables. But again, that's been another common theme is just, just do something, just make some effort, make some small change. And work is a great place to do it, right? Because it's where we spend most of our time. And then ideally you'll generalize that to, the broader scope of your life. But I don't think anybody should like minimize those small steps that you can take on a daily basis.
I agree. I think to answer my question of why we're still here is that like it's such a big endeavor that it's everyone keeps thinking that I have to start with this big step, you know what I mean? But like it has to start with a small one, you know what I mean? So that we can start somewhere.
May, thank you so much for this conversation. I don't think a lot of people have access to this wealth of information, and 100%, I think they don't have access to pairing this information with behavior analysis. So thank you so much for this conversation, for your contribution in the textbook. Is there any resources or things that you're up to that you'd like to share with hopefully this massive audience that's listening to us right now?
Hopefully, right? Yeah, and I try to, Michelle could attest to this, I really try to link behavior analysis to almost anything, because if it has to do with human behavior, it has to do with behavior analysis, and why we're doing or not doing something. But on April 16th, 2001, the Association for Behavior Analysis, in New Jersey, will be having their annual conference. It's going to be all virtual. So no one, even if you're not from Jersey, it's something that you don't have to travel here to attend and participate in. And I'm going to be talking about addressing racial bias in education. So really looking through, more, I talked about education and urban planning as part of the text. But this talk, I'll be really delving into how those racial biases are affecting in terms of like the disproportionality of out of school suspensions, of classification as general versus special education. And then because I'm from New Jersey, looking specifically at the expulsion data particular to our state. And then looking at kind of what behavior analysts can do to kind of as a replacement to these suspensions and expulsions, and what to do if they like how to look for the racial bias, and then what to do if they find it. Again, you're not like a one man, you know, one woman, one person crusader to kind of undo everything. And likely if you do find it, it's not on purpose. Like this, a lot of this is just, it's the foundation of how this country was built. So if you're noticing these kind of disparities, it's important not to be like, to slap the data down like I caught you, but to come with a solution. You know what I mean? Like it's like, you know what, recognizing that this particular teacher or this particular consequence might be a little bit unfair. And because, like I mentioned before, behavior analysis is objective, looking at it very objectively, these are some items that can help to mitigate the disproportionality. So we're not here to kind of blame anybody or point the finger, but it's just, again, we're not here to call out the problem behavior, but we want to investigate and evaluate what interventions are helping it to improve.
A lengthy shaping procedure.
Yeah, right. I like that. That's a good way to conceptualize it. So I'm excited for this because I think that a lot of the interventions that we have in place, I don't know, and it's no behavior analyst's fault, because only recently is that part of our code of ethics to kind of be culturally competent and really consider diversity, equity, and inclusion. But like, as we're putting these interventions in place, are we making it easier for one particular population to access reinforcement, or are we making it more difficult for one population to access that reinforcement? And that's, I'm hoping at the end of this, that's what behavior analysts will start thinking about, and also be a little bit more comfortable when they notice that. Like I've had, Michelle, I've had a couple of like our clinical associates who are in schools. And so and in a school district, you know, I'm the BC who's supervising, and then we have a lot of our staff who serve as one-to-one support for students or just to support a classroom. And in a lot of the behavior disabilities class, my staff will come up to me and be like, "It's weird." She's like, "There's only one white kid in the class." and like, if they're like whispering it, they're really nervous to talk about it. And they're just like, you know, that they don't really know if it's necessarily fair. And so I help them coming up with like how to collect the data, because like they feel like one particular student's getting in more trouble than another. You know what I mean? And I'm like, it's fine. Just do a blind recording. On one day, you're just taking data on this student. On another day, like you're forgetting all about it and doing it on a different student. And then we're gonna compare and show it to me without the name. You know what I mean? So that we can truly evaluate this. But I'm hoping that it gets people a little bit more comfortable, because I remember she was so like worried to say it out loud. And I'm like, oh, you're not blaming anybody. Like it could possibly be true. We're going to investigate, you know, like the student like who always has a stomach ache like right before math class. It's like, all right, we're not blaming them. It could be true. Let's actually look and see, like, is it always 5 minutes before math, or they now have a terrible stomach ache and they just can't possibly continue with the next class? You know, like it's no one's fault. No one's going to get blamed. Yeah. We need that information to know how to proceed.
Yeah. And that's being a good scientist, right? Just being, you know, constantly investigating, being inquisitive, and checking, you know, taking, like looking at the data, analyzing it. Now you've also done some other really great talks about racial bias, and like, you know, I mean, if you don't have the links or whatever to share right now, that's fine. But I'd also love to promote those as well, because I think those talks that you've given have been really interesting and really helpful, you know, for people who number one are interested, obviously, but like I think that there's a lot of information in there, again, that people like aren't aware of, that they need to hear. And I know those talks were really they were really powerful. So if that's something that, you know, at some point we could throw in the Facebook group so that everybody can have access to them, that would be great as well.
Unfortunately, I don't have those links, but I can, if there's a journal article that I kind of want to mention. Is that like, should we just add that to
yeah
with the links as well, or?
Yeah,
sure. for sure.
Okay.
Any information
If
you want to
anything
share.
comes to mind afterwards, yeah, share it our way, and then we'll post it.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking. I'm myself looking to get published in a journal, and so I did like a ton of research, and I found an article that was written last year. Can behavior analysis help us understand and reduce racism? And that was one of the very few behavior analytic articles that I found about specifically, you know, racism and equality and social injustice. So I was excited about that. Also in 2020, there was what behavioral science can contribute to police brutality and systemic racism, what behavior analysis tells us. So those are two articles that like I was super duper excited to find, because they were like everything else was kind of like by proxy. You know, it was talking about like cultural humility and diversity, but those two were just like right on target, you know what I mean? And also from behavior analytic journals, not like adjacent. Like I found a lot of things in like psychology journals and things like that, and I'm not disqualifying them, but I'm only mentioning that because I'm in the articles I'm trying to get published in want to see other articles from their same journal. You know what I mean? So that's why nothing bad about the articles published in psychology journals, but if I was specifically writing for a psychology journal, I think it would increase the likelihood that I would have been published.
It's a good plug for Doctors Garcia and Matsuda's conversation.
Yes, the other day, it's a fantastic conversation. Their contribution to the text is also really, really wonderful, and the work that they're doing is fantastic. And hopefully, you know, they'll continue to get more out there. Hopefully, you'll get published and get more of this information out there. So always a pleasure, May. We go way back. I love talking.
Yes, we do. I was excited when I saw this on my calendar for this week. I was excited. I'm like, I can't wait.
Well, like I said, always a pleasure, always a wealth of knowledge. Check me out at NJABA. We'll post some of those links up on the Facebook page and our website when it's up and running. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and both of you guys are when you were saying what steps can we make, exactly what you guys are doing. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.